The wind moved slowly across the plains as if it, too, was tired of traveling, brushing over dry grass, worn fences, and the long stretch of land where the sun always seemed to linger before leaving. And on that evening Elias Munro guided his horse along the narrow dirt road that led past the old Whitlow property, a place most folks avoided not because it was dangerous but because it felt heavy, like a memory no one wanted to carry. And Elias had lived long enough in the West to know that. Sometimes the quiet places held the most truth, though he told himself he was only taking the longer path home, nothing more. Yet his eyes still drifted toward the small house sitting alone against the open sky, its paint faded, its porch empty, its windows dark except for one soft glow near the back, and that was when he saw her, standing near the fence line, hands resting lightly on the weathered wood, her posture straight but tired, as if she had learned how to remain standing through long seasons of disappointment. And Elias slowed his horse without thinking, feeling a strange pull in his chest that had nothing to do with habit or reason, because everyone in town knew Clara Whitlow's story, or at least the version they preferred to repeat, how she had been married young and left alone younger, how the land had gone dry under her care, how hope seemed to pass her by like a train that never stopped, and people spoke of her with lowered voices, not out of kindness but out of relief. That her life was not their own, and Elias had never spoken to her before, though he had seen her many times at a distance, always quiet, always apart, always watching something no one else could see. And now as the light faded and the sky turned soft with dusk, he noticed the way her hair caught the wind, loose and dark against her pale collar, and the way her gaze stayed fixed on the far horizon, not searching but waiting, as if she believed something would eventually return to her if she stood there long enough. And Elias felt an ache he could not name, a deep and familiar feeling that reminded him of nights spent alone in his cabin after the loss of his wife, when silence became both comfort and burden, and without meaning to he cleared his throat, the sound cutting gently through the open air, and Clara turned, startled but composed, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and there was no fear in them, only a guarded calm, the kind born from learning not to expect much. And he tipped his hat out of habit and respect, murmuring a simple greeting, his voice low and steady, and she nodded once, not unfriendly, not warm, just present, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the land holding its breath around them, until Elias felt foolish for stopping at all. Yet something kept him rooted there, a sense that leaving now would mean carrying another unfinished moment with him, and so he asked how the evening found her. The words plain and careful, and she answered that it was quiet, always quiet, and there was no bitterness in her tone, only fact, and he nodded, understanding that more than he wished to admit. And as they stood there the wind picked up slightly, stirring dust along the road, and Elias noticed the ground near her fence looked different from the rest of the land, darker somehow, as if it remembered rain. And he asked about her crops, knowing the question might be unwelcome, but she surprised him by answering honestly, saying the soil was stubborn but not cruel, that it responded slowly but faithfully if treated with patience. And something in her words struck him, because no one else spoke of land like that anymore, as if it were alive and listening. And Elias found himself telling her about his own ranch beyond the creek, about the cattle that wandered too far, about the nights that felt longer than they should, and she listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face, and he felt seen in a way that unsettled him. As if she understood the weight of solitude not as a burden but as a shared language. And when a cloud passed over the moon, casting them briefly in shadow, Elias realized how late it had grown, and he excused himself, though the words felt wrong in his mouth, and Clara nodded again, her gaze drifting back toward the horizon. And as he turned his horse away, he felt a quiet regret settle in his chest, the kind that came from knowing something important had been left unsaid, and he rode on, telling himself it was nothing, just a passing moment. Yet the image of her standing alone by that fence followed him all the way home, and that night as he lay awake listening to the distant call of night birds and the slow creak of his cabin walls, he thought of the way her voice sounded steady even when speaking of loss, and he wondered how many times she had stood there watching the sun set without anyone stopping, how many times the world had decided she was already finished. And in the days that followed he found his thoughts returning to her without invitation, during chores, during meals, during the long stretches of quiet that once felt familiar but now felt hollow. And when a storm rolled in one afternoon, sudden and sharp, bringing rain that darkened the earth and filled the air with the smell of promise, Elias saddled his horse and rode without thinking, his path leading him back toward the Whitlow place as if the land itself were guiding him. And as he approached he saw Clara standing in the rain, her dress damp, her face lifted toward the sky, eyes closed, and there was something so raw and honest in that moment that Elias stopped short, not wanting to intrude, yet unable to turn away, because she looked like someone who had waited a long time for something gentle to find her, and when she noticed him she did not retreat, only looked at him with a question in her eyes, and he felt his heart tighten, knowing that whatever he said or did next might change the shape of both their lives. And as thunder rolled softly in the distance and rain fell between them like a curtain, Elias realized that this was not just about curiosity or kindness, but about a connection neither of them had planned for, and as he opened his mouth to speak, the wind shifted, carrying with it the feeling that this meeting, like the first, was only the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. She came to Red Mesa at noon when the sun stood straight and unforgiving above the desert, riding a tired horse with a black veil resting loose at her shoulders, and by nightfall everyone knew her name, though no one dared speak it aloud, because Lenora Hale carried stories the way the desert carried bones, quietly and without mercy, and the men at the saloon lowered their voices when she passed, remembering the whispers that followed her from town to town, that every man who loved her met a violent end, that luck twisted itself wrong around her heart, and Lenora heard it all without reacting, her face calm, her eyes distant, as if grief had long ago taught her how to keep still inside herself, and she took the small adobe house at the edge of town where the wind never rested and shadows stretched long at dusk, unpacking little more than worn dresses, a kettle, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, each one a life that had ended too soon, and she told herself she was done with staying, done with hoping, that Red Mesa was only another place to pass through until the ache inside her softened enough to let her move on. Yet the desert has a way of deciding otherwise, and 2 nights later, just as the moon rose thin and pale, a sound broke the quiet, a body collapsing against her door with a dull weight that carried pain in every breath, and Lenora froze before opening it, knowing the shape of fate too well, knowing how quickly a single choice could unravel a careful distance. But she opened the door anyway because some part of her had never learned how to turn away from someone in need, and there he lay, dust-covered, bleeding but alive, a gunslinger by the look of him, his revolver fallen from his hand, his eyes half open and clouded with fever, and she dragged him inside with a strength born from necessity, pressing cloth to his wound, speaking softly even as her hands shook, telling him to breathe, to stay, to not leave her with another ending she could not bear, and he did breathe, shallow but steady, his life clinging to her touch like a fragile thread, and as the night stretched on Lenora tended him in silence, cleaning the wound without asking questions, because questions led to names, and names led to attachment, and attachment had always led her to loss. Yet as dawn arrived and light spilled across the room, she studied his face, worn but gentle beneath the dust and pain, and something in her chest stirred against her will, a feeling she had buried deep after the last grave she stood beside, and when he woke he did so slowly, confusion flickering through his dark eyes before settling on her, and he tried to sit up but she stopped him with a firm hand and a quiet voice, telling him he was safe for now, and he laughed weakly at the word safe as if it were a stranger he no longer recognized, introducing himself as Jonah Cole, a man who had made too many wrong turns and paid for each one, and she gave only her first name, leaving the rest unspoken, and over the days that followed Jonah healed beneath her care, the desert heat pressing close, the town watching from a distance, because men noticed when Lenora Hale opened her door to someone and fear spread faster than kindness, and Jonah noticed it too, the way people avoided her gaze, the way silence followed her steps, and he asked her once what she had done to earn such careful distance, and she answered honestly that she had loved men who did not survive the lives they chose, and that was all, and Jonah did not flinch or smile or dismiss it as gossip, he only nodded as if understanding the weight of being marked by things you could not change, and something between them softened then, a quiet trust forming in shared glances and long evenings where they spoke of small things, the way the light shifted across the mesa, the sound of wind through dry brush, the comfort of company without demands, and Lenora found herself laughing once, surprised by the sound as if it belonged to someone else, and Jonah watched her with an expression that held both admiration and restraint, because he saw the sadness she carried and did not wish to add to it, yet attraction has its own language, and it spoke in the way his eyes followed her movements, in the way her hand lingered when she passed him a cup of water, and the town noticed too, the whispers growing sharper, warning Jonah to leave before the desert claimed him like the others, and when Jonah heard the stories he confronted Lenora gently, asking if she believed she was cursed, and she answered that she believed some people were born under difficult stars, and loving them came at a cost, and Jonah said that perhaps cost was simply part of living fully, and Lenora felt tears rise but did not let them fall, because hope was a dangerous thing to invite back into her life, and one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jonah told her he planned to leave once he was strong enough, not because he wanted to but because staying might bring trouble to her door, and the words settled between them like dust after a storm, heavy and final, and Lenora nodded, telling him it was wise, telling herself it was necessary. Yet when the night came she lay awake listening to his steady breathing from the other room, feeling the familiar ache of an ending before it arrived, and the next morning Red Mesa learned why Jonah Cole had been running, because men came riding in hard and fast, trouble written in their posture, asking questions with hands too close to their weapons, and Lenora felt the past rushing toward her once more, the same pattern, the same dread, and Jonah stood despite his weakness, telling her to stay inside, and she grabbed his arm, her voice shaking as she begged him not to face violence again, not for her, not for anyone, and Jonah looked at her with a softness that hurt more than fear, telling her some men spent their lives trying to outrun who they were, and some finally chose to stand, and before she could answer he stepped outside, the door closing with a final sound that echoed in her chest, and Lenora stood alone in the quiet room, hands trembling, knowing too well how these stories ended, yet refusing to look away, and when the sounds outside faded into silence, when the desert returned to its endless watching, she did not know whether fate had claimed another love or shown her mercy, only that her heart had already chosen, and whatever waited beyond that door would change her forever. Deadwood Crossing lay stretched beneath a hard sky like a place the world had forgotten on purpose, its buildings leaning into one another as if tired of standing alone, dust settling thick in the streets where laughter once lived, and into that quiet road Silas walked with a slow, uneven gait, his horse scarred, his coat worn thin, and a tarnished badge pinned to his chest that caught the sun like an accusation rather than a promise, and no one greeted him because no one believed law still mattered here, not after years of rule by fear and silence, and Silas felt every stare like weight on old bones, knowing he did not look like the hero stories once promised, knowing he did not feel like one either, because he had sworn never to wear that badge again after the day everything fell apart, after the screams and the fire and the moment he chose wrong and paid for it with lives he could never replace. And yet here he was, drawn back not by pride or duty but by a letter written in a trembling hand, a plea from a town that had nothing left to lose, and as he dismounted near the empty jailhouse, memories pressed close, the echo of boots on wood, the smell of sweat and fear, the sound of a crowd that believed in him once, and he pushed it all down because that was the only way he knew how to keep moving, and the people of Deadwood Crossing watched from doorways and windows, hope fighting with doubt in their eyes, because they had heard his name before, heard how Silas Ward had failed a town just like theirs, how he had ridden away afterward and never looked back, and when he spoke his voice was steady but quiet, telling them he would stay only long enough to help them prepare, that he was not here to be thanked or trusted, only to stand between them and what was coming, and what was coming had a name that traveled faster than horses, a man called Bracken Holt, who ruled the surrounding land with fear and men who followed because fear paid better than mercy, and Silas knew Holt well, knew the way his smile never reached his eyes, knew how chaos followed him like a shadow, because Holt had been there the night Silas failed, had watched from the edge as everything burned, and that knowledge settled heavy in his chest as he walked the streets again, noting weak points, counting empty windows, listening to the quiet that comes before something breaks, and he met the townsfolk one by one, a shopkeeper who kept a loaded rifle beneath the counter, a schoolteacher who still rang the bell each morning though no children came, a rancher who sharpened his knife more from habit than need, and each of them carried a different kind of fear, and Silas did not promise safety, because promises were what had ruined him before, but he taught them instead, how to stand watch, how to signal without sound, how to move together rather than alone, and at night he sat in the jailhouse, staring at the badge resting in his palm, remembering the weight of it when it first pinned to his chest, when he believed being a marshal meant you could fix what was broken, and sleep did not come easily, because dreams brought back the past in sharp detail, the night rain turned streets to mud, the shout he misheard, the order he gave too late, and the faces that never left him, and when morning came he rose tired but steady, because guilt had taught him endurance if nothing else, and as the town prepared, rumors rode in on the wind, Holt gathering men, Holt smiling at the thought of Deadwood Crossing daring to resist, and some townsfolk whispered about running, about leaving before the storm arrived, and Silas did not stop them, because he knew better than to ask people to risk everything for a man they barely trusted, yet those who stayed did so quietly, tightening their resolve without speeches or cheers, and among them Silas felt something stir that he had not felt in years, not hope exactly, but responsibility, the kind that does not ask whether you deserve it, only whether you will answer. And on the third night a rider came hard from the south, breathless with news that Holt's men were close, and the town gathered beneath the dim glow of lanterns, fear thick but held in check, and Silas stood before them, his voice carrying without force, telling them this would not be clean or easy, that some things could not be controlled, but that they would face it together. And as they dispersed he caught his reflection in the dark glass of the saloon window, seeing not the broken man he felt like but someone standing straight despite the weight, and that frightened him more than any threat, because caring again meant something could be lost, and when dawn arrived it did so slowly, like creeping over the ridge, and with it came Holt and his men, riding into view like a test the town had not studied for, and Silas stepped forward alone at first, hand resting near his side, heart steady despite the roar in his ears, and Holt laughed, calling out greetings as if they were old friends, mocking the idea of law returning to a place it had abandoned, and Silas answered calmly, telling Holt this town would not bow, and something in Holt's eyes hardened, recognition flashing there, because he remembered Silas too, remembered the man who once stood tall before breaking, and in that moment the past and present collided, all the choices Silas had made leading him here, and though fear brushed against him, it did not stop him, because he understood now that courage was not the absence of regret but the decision to move forward anyway, and as the standoff stretched thin and breath held tight across Deadwood Crossing, Silas felt the badge heavy against his chest, not as a burden this time but as a reminder that failure did not have to be the end of the story, and whatever happened next, whether the town stood or fell, he would not ride away again, and with that resolve burning quiet and strong inside him, he took one step forward, ready at last to face the ghosts he had carried for so long. Black Canyon cut through the land like an old wound that never healed, its walls rising sharp and dark against the sky, and people avoided it not because it was hard to reach but because it was too easy to hear things there that were better left unheard, and Jonah Reed knew all the stories as well as any man who had ever swung a pick in the desert. Stories of gold veins glowing like fire beneath the rock. Stories of men who went in hopeful and came out changed or not at all. Stories of whispers that followed you long after you left. Yet Jonah rode toward the canyon anyway with a folded map tucked close to his chest, because desperation has a way of making legends feel like instructions rather than warnings, and Jonah had reached the end of his luck, his hands blistered, his pockets empty, his name worn thin by too many failed promises, and the map had come to him by chance or curse when an old prospector collapsed outside a trading post, pressing the paper into Jonah's hand with a look that held both relief and regret, muttering about gold that belonged to no man. And Jonah told himself it was nonsense even as his heart beat faster, because hope, even dangerous hope, feels better than none at all, and as he crossed the open desert the air seemed to thicken, sounds carrying too far, shadows stretching wrong, and the first whisper came at dusk, soft as wind but shaped like words, calling his name though no one was there, and Jonah spun around, pulse racing, laughing it off as exhaustion, yet the voice returned the next night, closer, warmer, promising rest, promising reward, promising that everything he had lost could be returned tenfold if he only kept going, and Jonah told himself it was only his own thoughts echoing back to him, because admitting otherwise would mean turning around, and turning around meant facing the life he was running from, and when he finally reached Black Canyon the sky felt lower, the silence heavier, and the walls seemed to lean inward as if listening, and Jonah followed the map down narrow paths where sunlight barely touched the ground, each step carrying him deeper into a place that smelled of damp stone and old secrets, and the whispers grew clearer there, no longer distant but circling him, speaking with many voices that blended into one, telling him he was chosen, telling him the gold was waiting, telling him the price was small compared to what he would gain, and Jonah felt both fear and excitement coil together in his chest, because the voice spoke truths no stranger should know, naming his failures, his regrets, the nights he lay awake wishing he had chosen differently, and when he reached the hidden seam at last, he stopped breathing, because the rock shimmered faintly even in the dim light, gold threaded through stone like veins beneath skin, and all washed over him, followed quickly by hunger, and he began to dig, his hands moving faster than his thoughts, each strike of the pick answered by whispers that praised him, urged him on, told him he was finally worth something, and hours passed without time meaning much, until his arms ached and sweat soaked his shirt, and still he dug, because stopping felt impossible now, and when he finally pulled free a chunk of ore heavy and bright, the whispers fell silent for a moment, replaced by a ringing in his ears, and in that quiet Jonah felt something watching him, something patient and ancient, and the voice returned, no longer gentle, reminding him that nothing taken from Black Canyon was free, that every gift required balance, and Jonah laughed nervously, saying he had nothing left to give, and the canyon answered with a low rumble that shook loose pebbles from the walls, and images flooded his mind then, not visions but memories twisted sharp, faces of people he had wronged, chances he had wasted, roads he had chosen out of fear instead of courage, and the voice told him he could bury all of that here, that the canyon would take it in exchange for gold, that he would walk away lighter, richer, unburdened, and Jonah felt tears sting his eyes, because the offer was tempting in a way that hurt, yet beneath it he sensed the truth, that what the canyon wanted was not memory but self, not regret but identity, and he thought of the old prospector's eyes, the weight of the map, the warning hidden in the gift, and for the first time since his journey began Jonah stopped moving, his hands trembling as he dropped the pick, and the whispers grew angry then, pressing in on him, accusing him of weakness, telling him he would always be nothing without their gold, and fear wrapped tight around his chest, but so did resolve, because Jonah realized that if he stayed, even if he left rich, he would never truly leave at all, and with a cry that echoed too loudly, he turned away from the vein, leaving the gold glittering in the dark, and ran, stumbling through the narrow paths as the canyon seemed to shift around him, walls closing, shadows grabbing, voices shouting promises and threats in equal measure, and when he finally burst back into open desert, collapsing beneath the wide, indifferent sky, the whispers cut off as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only wind and Jonah's ragged breathing, and he lay there until dawn, shaking, empty-handed, but alive, and as the sun rose, painting the land gold in a way that asked for nothing in return, Jonah understood that the devil's gold was never meant to be carried out of Black Canyon, only to lure men into giving up pieces of themselves, and as he walked away with nothing but his shadow and his breath, he felt poorer in coin but richer in something harder to name, knowing the canyon would wait for the next desperate soul, patient as ever, whispering promises beneath the burning western sun.